Sensory differences for autistic individuals are based on that we perceive and process information from the environment differently. As a result, there may be too much information coming into some of the senses, and there may not be enough coming in to some of the others, and often the information that's received is distorted. So what it means is that autistic individuals commonly rely on undependable information from the environment. Well, for me, there are many sounds, sights, touches, smells, and tastes that can be overwhelming. So, for example, I tend to be sensitive to light. So, for example, many of you may perceive this hat as a fashion statement, but in reality, it's an accommodation. Because for me, being under recessed lighting fixtures is like looking into a spotlight for many other people. In terms of sound, we may be hypersensitive to various sounds in the environment. And we also may be hyposensitive or undersensitive. And in that case, you'll have an autistic person who seeks particular sounds. So for example, I may be undersensitive to low-pitched sounds, and I'll often go to movies if I suspect that there'll be some low-pitched, perhaps almost subsonic sounds. For tactile, many of us are hypersensitive to light touch. For me, my tactile sensitivity involves clothing. It's very difficult for me to tolerate tight clothing, so you may notice that a lot of my clothing is very loose. I'm very sensitive to I have a very sensitive sense of smell. So, for example, in many hotels, I've had to switch rooms a number of times. Even though they've claimed that the room is non-smoking, it only takes somebody who smoked on their break to track in the smell of smoke on their clothes or their hair, and then when they leave, the smell remains, and I have to change rooms. Likewise for taste, there can be hyper and hyposensitivities. For me, there are some spices that I really like, such as Indian and Thai food. I find Chinese spices to be a little bit more difficult to tolerate. Texture is an important part of eating and can cause challenges in feeding. So for me, I tend to like mono-textured foods, nothing like a smoothie. And also, the challenge I have is when there are carrots in a salad, because the carrots are too hard as contrasted to the rest of the salad. I remember as a young child experiencing a cherry tomato explode in my mouth, and that was such a sensory violation that I avoided tomatoes for 2 or 3 years. Yes, the outer senses I just described, sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell, emanate from outside the body. The inner senses emanate from within the body. And 3 of those senses include the vestibular, that is what helps us keep our balance. There's proprioception, which tells us where our body parts are in space and how much force to use to accomplish a task. And then there's interoception, which is the newest recognized sense, and that tells you about inner bodily states. So getting back to the vestibular, many of us may have a very good sense of balance. I have a good sense of balance. Others tend to be sensory seekers in the vestibular sense and will, for example, spin around in circles. It would spend all day on a roller coaster. Proprioception. Where is our body in the environment? And while most people take for granted, for example, that they know where their back ends and where the back of a chair begins, many of us on the autism spectrum aren't able to do that, and we may, in a way, according to practitioners of the Miller method, fuse with the environment. Proprioception is also what tells us how hard to hold a pencil and how far to move it around to write. And due to difficulties in this area, many of us on the autism spectrum are penmanship disaster areas. Now getting to interoception, that is what tells us, for example, when we've eaten enough food and we're full. That is also what tells us when we need to go to the bathroom. There are many practical strategies and solutions for people challenged with sensory issues. For sound, for example, perhaps wearing ear protection, wearing earplugs, or maybe just making sure that the environment is not too loud. Likewise, for the tactile, I mentioned my sensitivity to tight clothing. I have an autistic friend who's just the opposite, and he wears very tight clothing because he says it helps him understand where his body is in the environment. For the visual sense, for those of us who are sensitive to recessed lighting fixtures like me, wearing a hat with a bill, as I'm doing now, that helps a lot. There are also many autistic people who perceive fluorescent lights like most people perceive a strobe light. So while a strobe light might be fun on Halloween and for parties, nobody's going to be productive in what they perceive is a room lit with a strobe light all day at work. And getting to eating, many of us on the autism spectrum have challenges with feeding. I remember eating baby food until I was about age 4. And again, that was due mostly to the tactile qualities of food as opposed to the taste. But for other people, things may be different. So as we think about developing environmental accommodations to empower autistic individuals for greater success at home, in education, employment, relationships, and basically all aspects of life. If we think about these accommodations, many of them are helpful for other people as well. And often I think about hotels that will commonly advertise how they have these hypoallergenic rooms with no rugs to help keep down allergies, with beds having high thread counts and soft chairs to sit in. And then my question is, wouldn't everybody like such a nice, comfortable, and quiet hotel room? So it tends to be good for autistic individuals in terms of sensory accommodations, tends to be good for everybody else.